In the autumn of 1374, the Deshtai Kipchak steppe seemed to hold its breath. In the air, which grew sharp and brittle, old warriors read ill omens, seeing the color of dried blood in the crimson seas of feathergrass. Nature itself foretold disaster, and a sinister anticipation of the coming changes permeated everything. Something terrible was approaching. Bad omens multiplied throughout the horde. The fiery tails of comets streaked across the velvet night sky. Deformed foals were born in the herds, and wolves abandoned their lairs. It was as if Tengri, the celestial patron, had turned his back on the Ulus of Jochi. The higher powers were sending clear signs. The great state had been forsaken by the gods. The once indestructible monolith of the Golden Horde was in its death throes. For 15 years, it had been tormented by the fever of an internal crisis, known to history as the Great Troubles. The starting point was the assassination of Khan Berdebek, the last direct male descendant of Batu. With his death, the sacred thread of the legitimate dynasty was broken, shattering the very foundation of power. It was as if a dam had burst. After the death of the rightful ruler, an unrestrained power struggle began in the capital, Sarai. With kaleidoscopic speed, pretender khans replaced one another on the throne, more than 20 in 10 years. Appointed by scheming emirs, they ruled for months, weeks, or even days, managing only to distribute the treasury and lands to their supporters, which ultimately devalued the very concept of authority. The unified empire had effectively ceased to exist. In its heartland, the Volga region, the slaughter between supporters of deposed khans never stopped. In the west, in the Crimea, and on the Don, the powerful warlord Mamai held sway. He was not a Genghisid and had no right to the title of Khan, so he ruled through puppet rulers from the house of Batu, keeping vast territories under his personal control. In the east, beyond the Yaik River, the descendants of Batu's brother, Orda Ejin, watched the agony of the west with alarm and contempt. In their domains, the Kok Horde, order prevailed, and they were biding their time. Meanwhile, the empire's arteries, the great trade routes that carried silk, spices, and gold, fell into complete decay. The empire was rapidly growing poor. The economic collapse was exacerbated by total lawlessness. Caravans were robbed by anyone and everyone. Russian river pirates, the Ushquiniks, sailed their ships as far as New Sarai, plundering the horde's cities along the Volga and Kama rivers. Tribute from the Russian lands, a crucial source of silver, arrived irregularly, ending up in the hands of the powerful Mamai and never reaching the common treasury. The agony of the horde was closely watched by the young but already cunning Muscovite prince, Dmitry Ivanovich. In this era of the crimson, bloody autumn, when betrayal had become the norm and a dagger to a rival's throat was the ultimate argument, he was waiting for his moment. Power belonged to the strongest and most ruthless. It is in this atmosphere that our story begins. In the east, in the shadow of great events, a young man from the line of Genghis Khan named Tokhtamysh was coming of age. He was one of dozens of such princes, possessing neither an army nor wealth. His only assets were the pride of his lineage and an all-consuming, boundless ambition. He did not yet know the destiny that awaited him. This young man was fated to achieve the impossible. With unprecedented force, he would reassemble the shattered empire and make it blaze in one last crimson fire. Blinded by pride, he would challenge the most fearsome conqueror of the age, leading his people to an irreversible catastrophe. His story is a requiem for the great nomadic empire, a tale of a dizzying rise and a crushing fall, a journey that would begin at the throne of the Iron Lame Tamerlane in Samarkand. In the bloody chaos of the Great Troubles, descending from the conqueror of the universe, Genghis Khan was not a privilege, but a death sentence. Too many eagles circled over the steppe, and every descendant of the great clan was a target. Tokhtamysh belonged to one of the most influential branches of the Yochids, which made his position particularly dangerous. Tokhtamysh's father was the ruler of Mangishlak, Tuikhoja Oglan, a descendant of Tuka Timur, one of Jochi's 13 sons. This line was considered one of the noblest in the Golden Horde, the eastern part of the Ulus. However, in an era of turmoil, such a pedigree did not protect. On the contrary, it made its bearer a dangerous competitor for the supreme ruler, Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan, who ruled in the east, was an extraordinary figure. A descendant of Jochi from another branch, he was a cruel, domineering, and ambitious ruler who had managed to establish order with an iron fist in his part of the crumbling empire. His gaze was turned to the west, and he sought to unite the entire horde under his rule. On his path to absolute power, Genghis Khan tolerated no competition, and the noble, independent Tuikhoja, Tokhtamysh's father, was a thorn in his side. The ruler of Mangishlak likely refused to submit or participate in the campaign against Sarai, which sealed his fate. He became an obstacle that had to be removed. In 1376, Genghis Khan did not hesitate and gave the order to execute Tuikhoja. Overnight, Tokhtamysh became the son of an enemy of the people, deprived of his domain, wealth, and future. A mortal threat now loomed over him as well, and so he fled, saving his life. Where could a disgraced Genghisid from the Deshti Kipchak steppes run? There was only one path, south, beyond the Sir Darya River, to the lands of Transoxiana. It was there that the star of a new, most fearsome predator of that era was rising, Emir Timur, whom the world would remember by the nickname Tamerlane, or Timur the Lame. And here, we should pause for a moment. The fates of Tokhtamysh and Timur were tightly intertwined, like two sides of the same coin. It is impossible to understand the rise and fall of one without understanding the personality of the other. Their main difference was in their blood. Unlike Tokhtamysh, Timur was not a Genghisid. He came from the Turkified Mongol tribe of the Barlas. According to the sacred laws of the Yasa of Genghis Khan, Timur had no right to the title of Khan and ruled his entire life through puppet Genghisids, contenting himself with the more modest but significant title of Emir. He compensated for his lack of noble blood with military genius, devilish cunning, and inhuman cruelty. In his youth, Timur suffered severe injuries that left him lame in his right leg and damaged his right arm. But these physical handicaps only forged his will into a steel blade. By the time Tokhtamysh fled, Emir Timur had already crushed all his rivals, becoming the absolute master of Transoxiana. This man was a tapestry of contradictions. He transformed his capital, Samarkand, into a glittering center of the world, gathering artisans there from all conquered lands. He was a merciless destroyer who built pyramids of severed heads, and at the same time, a fine connoisseur of art who gathered poets and scholars at his court. Driven by the ideas of restoring the empire of Genghis Khan and patronizing Islam. Picture the scene. In the autumn of 1376, Tokhtamysh arrives at the court of this mighty ruler, a young, ragged, and exhausted exile with a handful of loyal warriors stands before the iron lame in his Samarkand palace, the Koksarai. He has stepped directly into a dazzling but deadly fire. The walls of the hall in the Koksarai palace were adorned with frescoes depicting the emir's victories. His formidable commanders stood by the throne. Timur himself, a middle-aged man with a large head and a reddish beard, possessed a gaze that, according to contemporaries, lacked sparkle but pierced the very soul and evoked a primal fear. Before this formidable lord, Tokhtamysh told his story. He asked not for charity, but for justice and help, citing his high birth and the lawlessness committed by Genghis Khan. Timur, a master of the political game, listened with utmost attention, instantly assessing the situation. Emir Timur was a brilliant strategist. The Golden Horde, his northern neighbor, had always been both a threat and a coveted prize. He remembered how the Horde's Khans had interfered in the affairs of Transoxiana. A strong and united horde under the ambitious Genghis Khan posed a direct and clear danger to him. Timur favored a horde that was weakened and torn by internal strife, one in which he could pull the strings. And the legitimate Genghisid, Tokhtamysh, was the perfect Trojan horse. By placing him on the throne, the Iron Lame would gain a dependent ally in the north, and in the long run, the entire Golden Horde as a vassal. The decision was made instantly. Timur bestowed truly royal honors upon the fugitive, calling him his son. He gave him the border cities of Otrar and Sauron to govern. He supplied him with money, weapons, and troops, everything necessary to return to the steppe and fight for power. For the young Tokhtamysh, this was an incredible gift from the heavens, the chance of a lifetime. He was likely dazzled by such generosity and felt sincere gratitude and devotion to the emir. He did not yet understand the true, far-reaching motives of his new patron. The favor of great rulers is never selfless. The young exile did not see the steel strings with which the Iron Lame was entangling his destiny. He was merely a blade that Timur was sharpening for a strike against his enemy. But a blade is a double-edged weapon, and no one then could have predicted that one day it would turn against its creator. Having received an army and resources, Tokhtamysh transformed from a pathetic fugitive into a formidable contender for the throne of the Kok Horde. He prepared to return to the steppe to challenge his enemy, Genghis Khan. His path to power lay through blood, demanding incredible perseverance and a readiness for defeat. This was not a single victorious campaign. It was a series of desperate gambles, each of which could have been his last. In the winter of 1376, Tokhtamysh invaded the domains of Genghis Khan, beginning his long and bloody struggle for the throne. The first blow fell on the eastern domains of the Kok Horde. Initially, Tokhtamysh met with success, as Genghis Khan was occupied on the western borders and did not react immediately. He managed to win over several disgruntled clans, but as soon as the old Khan turned his main forces, luck deserted our hero. Against the battle-hardened army of Genghis Khan, Tokhtamysh's detachments were powerless. In the very first major battle, he suffered a crushing defeat, and having lost his entire army, fled again to save his life. He returned to Samarkand in disgrace. Anyone else in Timur's place would have driven away such a failure. But the Iron Lame was a player who didn't quit the game after the first setback. He viewed Tokhtamysh as a long-term investment. He welcomed his son again, scolded him for his carelessness, but gave him a new, even larger and better equipped army. And Tokhtamysh once again crossed the Sir Darya. This time, taught by bitter experience, he acted more cautiously, avoiding major battles. He waged a guerrilla war, conducting raids, capturing herds, and taking people captive. Urus Khan sent his eldest son and heir, the renowned warrior Kutlug Buga, against him. In one of the fierce skirmishes, Kutlug Buga, the heir of Urus Khan, was struck down by a stray arrow. This death had dual consequences. On one hand, it eliminated one of Tokhtamysh's enemies. On the other, it brought upon him the untamable wrath of the old Khan, who now craved personal revenge for his son. Urus Khan personally led the campaign at the head of all his forces. He reached the city of Sauran, which belonged to Tokhtamysh, and besieged it. The situation became critical. It was then that Timur himself intervened again, unable to allow his protégé to perish and unwilling to lose his border cities. The two great armies met on the banks of the Sir Darya. For several days they stood facing each other, hesitant to start the battle. But nature intervened in human affairs. An unusually severe winter began with heavy snowfalls, making the continuation of the campaign impossible. The armies dispersed without ever fighting. This respite saved Tokhtamysh, and soon fate presented him with a truly royal gift. In that same year of 1377, his sworn enemy, Urus Khan, died. After his death, a struggle for the throne immediately began in the Kokh Horde among his sons. The heirs of Urus Khan proved to be weak rulers. First, his second son, Tokhtamysh, ascended the throne, but he ruled for only a few months and soon died. Then, the third son, Timur Malik, became Khan. He was the complete opposite of his father. Dissolute, prone to drunkenness, he had neither authority nor talent, which caused widespread discontent among the emirs. Tokhtamysh realized this was his moment to shine. For the third time, having received help from Timur, he gathered an army and invaded the Kokh Horde. Emirs, disillusioned with Timur Malik's rule, began to defect to his side in droves. In the decisive battle, the army of Urus Khan's heir was defeated, and he himself was killed. In the spring of 1378, Tokhtamysh was proclaimed Khan of the Kokh Horde. His 2-year journey as an exile, full of humiliation and defeat, ended in triumph. However, he saw this throne merely as the first step, a stepping stone to the main throne of the Golden Horde in Sarai. Meanwhile, events were unfolding in the west that played into his hands. In that same year of 1378, on the Kondurcha River, Mamai's protégé suffered his first serious defeat at the hands of the Muscovite prince, Dmitry. The prestige of the powerful warlord was severely shaken. 2 years later, in 1380, the Battle of Kulikovo took place. Mamai, having gathered all his forces and allied with the Lithuanian prince Jogaila, moved to punish Moscow but was utterly routed. It was a colossal blow to his authority. In the eyes of the steppe nomads, he was no longer a fortunate leader, having been defeated by his own vassals. Tokhtamysh followed these events with intense focus. Mamai's defeat at Kulikovo was his signal to act. He did not delay, and gathering all the forces of the Kokh Horde, he moved west, towards the Volga region, to deliver the final, decisive blow to his weakened and demoralized rival. The decisive clash occurred in the autumn of 1380 on the Kondurcha River, the same place where the ancestors of the Horde had won their first great victory against the Rus. But this time, there was virtually no battle. Mamai's warriors, their morale broken, looked to the east, from where a new force was coming, a legitimate Genghisid. As soon as they saw the banners of Tokhtamysh, Mamai's warriors began to defect to his side in droves. They had no desire to fight and die for a defeated, and most importantly, illegitimate ruler against a true descendant of Genghis Khan. Abandoned by all, Mamai fled with a handful of followers. The powerful warlord sought refuge in the Genoese colony of Kaffa, with which he had long-standing ties. But the Genoese, always knowing which way the wind was blowing, chose not to quarrel with the new, powerful Khan. According to one version, they let Mamai in, but soon treacherously killed him on the orders of Tokhtamysh's emissaries. In early 1381, having eliminated his last rival, Tokhtamysh triumphantly entered Sarai. The great troubles, which had tormented the country for over 20 years, were over. On the throne of the united Golden Horde sat a new, young, energetic, and most importantly, legitimate Khan. He now held a vast empire from the Irtysh River to the Dniester. It seemed as though the Golden Horde was being reborn in all its former glory, and the new Khan's first order of business was to turn his attention to his northern Russian vassals. During the turmoil, they had managed to forget who their true master was, and he was particularly interested in the one who had dared to defeat his predecessor. The accession of Tokhtamysh was met with great relief in the horde. 2 decades of bloody infighting had exhausted and bled the steppe dry. The people were tired of chaos and yearned for order, stability, and a strong hand. They wanted their state to be great again and placed all their hopes on the new Khan. Tokhtamysh seemed the ideal ruler. He was young, energetic, and successful. But most importantly, he was an undisputed Genghis Khan, the bearer of the sacred blood of the conqueror of the universe. His rise to power was seen as the end of the long curse that had hung over the Ulus of Yochi. And the new Khan's first steps fully justified these expectations. He acted quickly, harshly, and decisively. A wave of executions swept through the steppe. He ruthlessly dealt with all of Mamai's supporters and separatists. He either eliminated all the emirs who had participated in the troubles or forced them to swear allegiance. He fully restored the shattered vertical of power, appointing his loyal governors, mostly emirs who had come with him from the east, to all key regions. Simultaneously with strengthening his political authority, he actively began to restore the ruined economy. The main economic task was to revive the caravan routes, the foundation of the horde's wealth. He sent punitive detachments to destroy bandits, confirmed trade privileges for Genoese and Venetian merchants, and began minting a new, full-weight silver coin with his name, symbolizing a return to financial stability. Tokhtamysh's goal was not reform, but restoration. He sought to restore the good old order of the times of the great Khans, Uzbeg and Janibeg, and that order implied the complete and unconditional submission of all vassals, especially the Russian princes who had grown bold during the turmoil. From Tokhtamysh's perspective, Dmitri's victory at the Battle of Kulikovo, even though it was against his enemy and the usurper Mamai, was an act of flagrant insubordination by a vassal to the supreme authority of the horde. It was a challenge that could not be ignored, for Mamai, though a usurper, had ruled from the legitimate capital, Sarai. By rebelling against Mamai, Dmitri, from the standpoint of the horde's imperial law, had rebelled against the authority of the Khan itself. Tokhtamysh could not let such a brazen act go unpunished. Forgiveness would have been perceived throughout the Ulus as a sign of weakness and the new ruler's inability to control his tributaries. Punishing Moscow was a matter of political necessity. In the autumn of 1380, immediately after his accession in Sarai, Tokhtamysh sent envoys to all the Russian princes. The message was simple. He had defeated their common enemy, Mamai, and now demanded that everyone, including Dmitry of Moscow, come to the horde with tribute and bow in submission, as was customary. The Russian princes found themselves in a difficult position. They understood the difference between the illegitimate usurper Mamai and the legitimate Genghisid Tokhtamysh perfectly. Most of them, including Moscow's longtime rivals, the princes of Tver and Ryazan, immediately sent envoys to the horde with declarations of complete submission. But Dmitry of Moscow hesitated. In the euphoria following the great victory at Kulikovo, he likely believed that the time of the horde's dominion was gone for good. He received Tokhtamysh's envoys with honor and sent them rich gifts, but he did not go to the horde himself and was in no hurry to pay the tribute. The entire year of 1381 passed in this uncertainty. Dmitry apparently hoped that Tokhtamysh would have other things to worry about, that the new Khan would get bogged down in solving the internal problems of the vast and ravaged horde. This was his fatal miscalculation. He underestimated the strength, determination, and ambition of the new master of the steppes. Tokhtamysh regarded the Muscovite prince's behavior as a direct insult and a challenge. After spending a year consolidating his power within the horde, in the summer of 1382 he assembled a huge army. His goal was not tribute, but humiliation. He was coming to teach a bloody lesson and to show everyone, both vassals and enemies, that the turmoil was over and a true master had appeared in the steppe. To ensure the surprise of his invasion, Tokhtamysh resorted to a ruse. On his orders, Russian merchants in all horde cities were arrested and robbed. Their ships on the Volga were confiscated so that no one could carry the news of the impending campaign to Moscow. The horde, united and hungry for plunder after the long turmoil, readily answered the Khan's call. A huge army, like a spring flood, moved north. Moscow, reveling in its recent victory, did not yet know what a terrible storm was gathering over its head. The summer of 1382 in Russes was hot and peaceful. 2 years had passed since the Battle of Kulikovo, and it seemed the main threat was gone. Many sincerely believed that the hated yoke had been thrown off forever. This atmosphere of complacency and self-confidence played a cruel joke on Moscow. Tokhtamysh's army moved in deep secrecy. To remain undetected, it did not follow the traditional southern routes, which were guarded by Russian patrols, but made a flanking maneuver along the deserted right bank of the Volga. The first to learn of the horde's approach was the Prince of Nizhny Novgorod Suzdal, Dmitry Konstantinovich, Dmitry Donskoy's father-in-law. Faced with a terrible choice, to join Moscow and be destroyed or to submit, he chose the latter. To prove his loyalty to the Khan, he not only failed to warn his son-in-law, but also sent his 2 sons to act as guides for the horde's army. Prince Oleg of Ryazan did the same. His lands lay directly in the path of the horde, and he remembered well how Mamai had ravaged his principality on the way to Kulikovo. Unwilling to see a repeat, he showed Tokhtamysh the fords on the Oka River known only to him, opening the way for the enemy into the very heart of Moscow's domains. This act of vassal loyalty or betrayal by its neighbors deprived Moscow of any chance to organize a defense. The news that Tokhtamysh had already crossed the Oka and was only a few days' march away caught Dmitry Donskoy by surprise. He had no time to assemble his regiments. Unable to give battle in the open field, Dmitry took a step that historians still debate. He left Moscow and went to Kostroma to gather an army. His cousin and hero of Kulikovo, Vladimir of Serpukhov, also left the capital. The city was left without a high command. The prince's departure caused a panic. The boyars and wealthy citizens rushed to flee after him. But the common people of Moscow, feeling betrayed, rose in rebellion. They convened a vesh, a popular assembly, sealed the city gates, and decided to defend themselves to the last, forcing the few remaining boyars to lead the defense. On August 23, 1382, the advance units of Tokhtamysh approached Moscow. The city was well fortified, thanks to the new white stone Kremlin built shortly before. A young Lithuanian prince, Ostej, a grandson of Algirdas, took command of the spontaneously formed militia. Despite the absence of their prince, the Muscovites were full of resolve. They crowded the walls, showering the horde with taunts and curses. As the chronicle records, a certain clothmaker named Adam, standing on the Frol gate, loudly reviled the Khan himself, enraging the besiegers. For the first time in its history, Moscow offered armed resistance to the horde. The defenders not only fiercely repelled attacks, but also made daring sorties. They even had firearms, tyufyaks, and primitive cannons. For 3 days, the horde, lacking siege equipment, unsuccessfully stormed the walls, suffering heavy losses. Tokhtamysh realized he could not take the city by force and resorted to his favorite tactic: deception. On the 4th day of the siege, August 26th, high-ranking horde nobles rode up to the walls. To the horror and confusion of the Muscovites, they were accompanied by Russian princes, Vasily and Semyon, the sons of the ruler of Nizhny Novgorod. The envoys addressed the defenders with peaceful speeches. They swore that the Khan was at war only with Prince Dmitry, not with the city. He merely wished, they said, to see his patrimony of Moscow. They offered peace and forgiveness to all, calling on them to open the gates and come out with gifts, promising that not a hair on their heads would be harmed. Exhausted by the 3-day siege, the Muscovites believed the oaths. The main factor that influenced their decision was the presence of the Russian princes, who acted as guarantors of their safety. Prince Ostej, the boyars, and the clergy made a fatal mistake. They ordered the gates to be opened, and a solemn procession exited the city to meet the Khan. As soon as the procession passed through the gates, the horde soldiers fell upon the unarmed people and slaughtered them all, starting with Prince Ostej. Through the open gates, cavalry poured into the defenseless city. A terrible massacre began. People were killed indiscriminately, sparing neither women nor the elderly nor children. The city was completely plundered. The horde took everything of value: gold, silver, furs, and the entire princely treasury was captured. Those who tried to hide in stone churches were burned alive. Thousands of people were taken into slavery. As the chronicler writes, so few living remained in the city that there was no one to bury the dead. After spending only a few days in Moscow, Tokhtamysh, with immense booty, began his return journey. Along the way, his warriors ravaged Vladimir, Zvenigorod, and Mozhaisk. Only near Volokolamsk did a detachment led by Vladimir of Serpukhov, who had managed to gather a small force, succeed in defeating one of the horde's units. When Dmitry Donskoy returned, he saw a scene of utter devastation. The lesson taught by Tokhtamysh was cruel and effective. That autumn, the broken prince was forced to send his eldest son and heir, the future Vasily I, to the horde to receive the Yarlik, the charter for the Grand Principality, from the Khan's hands. Russia's once again acknowledged itself as a tributary and vassal of the Golden Horde. The payment of tribute, the horde's exit, was resumed in full. The campaign of 1382 became the zenith of Khan Tokhtamysh's power. He had achieved everything he wanted and returned to Sarai with untold riches and the glory of a great conqueror. He had shown the whole world that the Golden Horde was reborn. Sitting in his palace in Sarai, surrounded by glory and wealth, he may have come to believe that there was no limit to his power. And at this moment of supreme triumph, the seeds of pride were sown in his soul, seeds that would ultimately lead him to a crushing catastrophe. At the pinnacle of his power, he forgot to whom he owed his rise. He forgot about his father and patron, the Iron Lame. And from Samarkand, Tamerlane watched his son's successes closely. On the southern borders of the Horde, a new, far more terrible knot of conflict was already tightening, the Khwarezmian knot. After the subjugation of Rus, for several years, Tokhtamysh became the master of a colossal empire from Siberia to the Balkans. His authority in the Golden Horde had not been so unified and undisputed since the time of Khan Janibeg. All internal enemies were destroyed, and all external vassals were brought to unconditional submission. Tokhtamysh proved himself not only as a conqueror, but also as a far-sighted ruler. He understood perfectly that the prosperity of his nomadic empire depended directly on international trade, and therefore actively patronized the caravan routes, ensuring their safety along their entire length. Particularly important were relations with the Genoese colonies in the Crimea and at the mouth of the Don, through which all Black Sea trade passed. Tokhtamysh confirmed their privileges with special charters, which ensured a huge flow of trade duties into his treasury and contributed to economic growth. During his reign, the Horde's cities on the Volga, New Sarai, Haji Tarkhan, Bulgar, experienced their last flourishing. Archaeological finds indicate developed craftsmanship. On the coins minted in his name throughout the Ulus, he is called by lavish titles such as the Just Sultan. The Russian princes paid their tribute without a murmur. Dmitry Donskoy's eldest son, Vasily, spent several years in the Horde as a guest hostage. Using the classic policy of divide and conquer, Tokhtamysh distributed charters as he saw fit, sometimes transferring the Grand Principality to Tver, then returning it to Moscow for a bribe. His authority was also recognized on the western borders. The Lithuanian Grand Duke Jogaila, who also became the King of Poland, sought an alliance with him. Even the distant Egyptian Mamluks, traditional allies of the Horde, sent embassies with rich gifts to Sarai. It seemed Tokhtamysh had restored the empire of Yochi in all its former splendor. And it was at this moment, at the height of his glory, that he made his main, fatal mistake. He decided that he was not just equal to, but superior to his former patron, Emir Timur. He forgot that it was Timur who had saved him, a ragged fugitive, given him an army, and helped him ascend the throne. In the eyes of Tokhtamysh, a legitimate descendant of the conqueror of the universe, Timur was nothing more than an upstart emir, a non-Genghisid. And if so, then all the lands that had once been part of the unified Mongol Empire, including Transoxiana and other territories conquered by Timur, should by right of blood belong to him, Tokhtamysh. The formal pretext for war, the apple of discord, was Khwarezm. This ancient and rich region in the lower reaches of the Amu Darya, with its capital Urgench, was the jewel of Central Asia, a major center of crafts and transit trade. Its possession promised colossal wealth. Historically, Khwarezm had been part of the Ulus of Yochi. However, during the Great Troubles, it had effectively seceded. Timur, consolidating his power, could not tolerate the existence of this independent neighbor, and by 1379 had finally conquered it. annexing it to his empire. As soon as Tokhtamysh united the entire Golden Horde under his rule, he, as a restorer of the old borders, immediately and in ultimatum-like terms, demanded that Timur return Khwarezm, considering it the ancestral and inalienable land of the Ulus of Yochi. Tokhtamysh's envoys, who arrived at Timur's court, behaved arrogantly and insolently. The Iron Lame was enraged. He considered Khwarezm his legitimate conquest, paid for with the blood of his soldiers. To give it up would be to show weakness and acknowledge Tokhtamysh's supremacy. He refused. After the refusal, relations between the former allies began to deteriorate rapidly. In 1385, while Timur was at war in Persia, Tokhtamysh made the most treacherous move. He stabbed him in the back, invading Azerbaijan from the north, which Timur already considered his sphere of influence. Tokhtamysh's troops passed through Azerbaijan with fire and sword. They captured and sacked its capital, one of the richest cities of that time, Tabriz. The booty seized in the city was colossal. With this untold wealth, the Horde army turned back to the steppes. After plundering Tabriz, Tokhtamysh's army began its return journey. However, during the retreat, it was attacked by local rulers and mountain tribes and suffered significant losses, though this did not mar the triumph of such a daring and successful raid. This raid on Tabriz was the last straw for Timur. It was not just an invasion, but a personal insult, a stab in the back delivered by an adopted son who had robbed his father's house. The Iron Lame was known for his beastly vindictiveness and never forgave betrayal. War became inevitable. Timur began preparing for a campaign to the north, into the very heart of the Desht-i-Kipchak. He knew well that the war would be long and difficult. Tokhtamysh was a formidable opponent, the lord of endless steppes, whose cavalry was no less numerous and fierce than his own. Tokhtamysh, intoxicated by his easy victory and immense booty, was also preparing for war. He was absolutely confident in his strength. He believed that in an open steppe war, his nomads, accustomed to the local conditions, had an undeniable advantage over Timur's settled army. The two greatest commanders of the era, former allies turned mortal enemies, prepared for a decisive clash. At stake was not just the possession of Khwarezm, but power over all of Central Asia and Eastern Europe. The entire world of that time held its breath in anticipation of this titanic battle. The winter of 1390 was a time of feverish military preparations. The Iron Lame prepared for the campaign with terrifying thoroughness. This was not to be a mere punitive raid like the one on Moscow. This was a campaign of total annihilation. He announced a general levy of all the troops of his vast empire. From the Hindu Kush to the Caucasus, from India to Mesopotamia, all vassals were ordered to appear with their regiments in Samarkand. Forges worked around the clock, smithing weapons, workshops sewed armor, provisions were gathered. Timur's army was not just a horde, but a complex, superbly organized military machine. It was divided into corps, divisions, and regiments. It had heavy, armored cavalry, light cavalry with bows, and infantry armed with Greek fire and primitive artillery. In January of 1391, this gigantic armada, numbering around 200,000 men by various estimates, set out from Tashkent to the north. Its path lay through the hostile, desolate, and snow-covered steppes of Desht-i-Kipchak. Learning of the invasion, Tokhtamysh chose the classic tactic of the nomads, the scorched earth policy that had brought his ancestors success more than once. He did not accept battle at the border. His mobile detachments retreated deep into the steppe, burning the grass, poisoning the wells, and driving off the livestock to wear down Timur's army with hunger. An unprecedented campaign in the history of military art began. For nearly 5 months, Timur's huge army moved through the lifeless, hostile steppe. It was a true death march. Soldiers suffered from hunger and thirst, and a mass death of horses began. Many lost heart. Even the most steadfast emirs grumbled and urged Timur to turn back, but the Iron Lame was adamant. He shared all the hardships of the campaign with his soldiers, ate the same food, and slept on the bare ground. His unbending will held the army together and led it forward, towards its goal. Finally, in June of 1391, Timur's exhausted and thinned army reached the region beyond the Volga, where Tokhtamysh was waiting for him at the Kondurcha River. The Khan decided that the enemy was sufficiently weakened, and the time for the decisive battle had come. His own army had no supply problems and outnumbered the enemy. On June 18, 1391, one of the largest and bloodiest battles of the Middle Ages began. Tokhtamysh arranged his army in the traditional nomadic crescent formation, intending to envelop and surround Timur's army with his strong flanks. But Timur, a brilliant tactician, saw through this plan. He countered it with a complex formation of 7 corps, creating several lines of defense and a powerful reserve under his personal command. In front of the army, he ordered a ditch to be dug and barriers erected to neutralize the first furious onslaught of the Horde's cavalry. The Horde's cavalry, with whoops and whistles, crashed into the right flank of Timur's army. The blow was of such devastating force that the ranks of the Iron Lame's warriors wavered. For a moment, it seemed that Tokhtamysh was winning. His warriors broke through the first line of defense, and anticipating victory, rushed to plunder the enemy's baggage train. It was at this critical moment that Timur displayed his military genius. He threw his elite reserve into the battle, which delivered a crushing counterblow to the flank and rear of the Horde soldiers who had broken through and lost their formation. At the same time, another of his corps, hidden in a ravine, attacked the weakened center of Tokhtamysh's army. The Horde's attack faltered. A fierce, merciless hand-to-hand fight began, which, according to chroniclers, lasted for 3 days. It was a real slaughter. The outcome of the battle was decided not only by Timur's brilliant tactics, but also by the iron discipline of his warriors, who, unlike the Horde, fought as a single mechanism. On the 3rd day of the battle, Tokhtamysh's army, having suffered monstrous losses and being completely disorganized, wavered and fled in a panic. Timur immediately organized a pursuit. His cavalry chased and cut down the fleeing for hundreds of kilometers, showing them no mercy. The losses of the Golden Horde were catastrophic. According to some reports, up to 100,000 people died, including one of Tokhtamysh's sons. The flower of the Horde's aristocracy and army was annihilated. The Khan himself, with a handful of bodyguards, barely managed to escape, once again showing miraculous resourcefulness. However, Timur's army was too exhausted by the 5-month campaign to pursue the enemy and march on Sarai. Instead, the Iron Lame camped on the battlefield for 26 days, celebrating his victory. Tokhtamysh's headquarters, his harem, and untold riches were captured. Then, laden with booty, Timur slowly moved home. The Battle of the Kondurcha River was a terrible blow to Tokhtamysh. It was his first major defeat, depriving him of both his army and his reputation as an invincible leader. His authority in the Horde was seriously shaken. Many emirs, especially in the east, began to turn away from him, believing that fortune had abandoned him. The monolith of his empire had developed a deep crack. It seemed he was finished. But Tokhtamysh would not have been himself if he had given up. He had an astonishing, almost supernatural ability to recover from the most crushing blows. He had lost a battle, but not the war, and as he licked his wounds, he was already plotting his revenge. The defeat at Kondurcha was a catastrophe, but not the end. Anyone else in his place would have been immediately overthrown. But Tokhtamysh understood the psychology of the steppe. Nomads respect only strength and luck. Having lost both, he had to prove as quickly as possible that he hadn't been written off. Returning to Sarai, he found his empire falling apart. The eastern domains had broken away, and Timur, as he left, had prudently installed his own puppet khans at the head of the Golden Horde, chosen from the descendants of Genghis Khan, Tokhtamysh's old enemies. But Tokhtamysh acted with astonishing energy. His main support came from the nomadic aristocracy of the Volga region and the northern Black Sea coast, who had a vested interest in preserving the unity of the horde and its trade routes. He announced a new recruitment for the army, and the steppe once again answered his call. He sent out messengers, pleading, persuading, and threatening. He used all his authority as a legitimate Genghisid, appealing to loyalty to tradition and the memory of their great ancestors. And the steppe, strangely enough, followed him again, seeing in him the only legitimate force capable of resisting disintegration. The Golden Horde's capacity for rapid military regeneration was phenomenal, as every adult nomad was a born warrior. In just 2 or 3 years, Tokhtamysh managed to assemble a new army, no smaller than the previous one. He expelled Timur's protégés and restored his authority over most of the Ulus of Jochi. And this newfound power once again went to his head. He had learned no lessons from his crushing defeat. Instead of strengthening his weakened state and avoiding conflict with his powerful southern neighbor, blinded by pride, he decided to seek revenge. His hatred for Timur, mixed with envy and a sense of deep humiliation, demanded vengeance. He likely considered his defeat at Kondurcha an accident, a tactical error. He longed to prove to the world that he, a legitimate Genghisid, was stronger than the rootless, lame emir. In 1394, he decided the time for a new strike had come. He began negotiations with the Egyptian Mamluks and the Ottoman Sultan Bayezid, trying to create a broad anti-Timur coalition. But, impatient by nature, he did not wait for this coalition to form. In the autumn of 1394, while Timur was busy with a war in the Caucasus, Tokhtamysh made his last, desperate gamble. He decided to strike from behind again. Gathering all his restored forces, he invaded Transcaucasia through the famous Derbent Pass, the gateway for nomadic invasions. This campaign was even more daring than the raid on Tabriz. Tokhtamysh acted not just as a plunderer, but as a rightful master, invading the very heart of his enemies' domains. He ravaged the cities of Shirvan, and instead of fleeing with the booty, set up camp on the northern bank of the Terek River, openly awaiting Timur's reaction. With this act, Tokhtamysh was throwing down a gauntlet to the iron lame. He was demonstrating that he was strong again, that he did not fear him, and that he had come to take what he considered his by right of blood. Timur's reaction was predictable and terrible. When Timur was informed of the invasion, his fury knew no bounds. The ungrateful son had not only failed to repent, but had delivered a new, even more insulting blow. As the chroniclers write, the emir's face darkened, and he swore a terrible oath. This time, not just to drive Tokhtamysh out, but to destroy his ulis, to ruin his cities and exterminate his people, to put an end to this threat forever. The second great campaign of Timur against the Golden Horde began. But this time, he was driven not by cold political calculation, but by an all-consuming thirst for revenge. He was marching not to conquer, but to destroy. Two gigantic armies once again moved towards each other for the final decisive battle. Tokhtamysh awaited Timur in the North Caucasus, on the bank of the Terek River. He was confident in his position. His army was fresh and full of strength. He believed he would learn from his past mistakes and win this time. It was his last, desperate gamble. He did not know that he was leading his horde not to glory and revenge, but to an apocalypse. In the spring of 1395, on the northern bank of the swift Terek River, a gigantic city of yurts and tents stretched out, the camp of Khan Tokhtamysh. Here, on the border of the endless steppes and the gray mountains of the Caucasus, confident in his strength, he awaited his mortal enemy. The mood in the horde's army was high. The horror of the defeat at Kondurcha had faded from memory, replaced by a thirst for revenge and anticipation of rich plunder. Timur's army approached from the south, brutally suppressing the resistance of the mountaineers and leaving behind pyramids of severed heads. On April 15, 1395, the vanguard of Timur's army reached the Terek. The two greatest armies of the time stood facing each other, separated only by the turbulent river. The world held its breath. For several days, the opponents maneuvered along the river, searching for a favorable position to cross and give battle. Timur employed a military ruse. He pretended to retreat and began to move demonstratively upstream. Tokhtamysh, thinking the enemy was afraid, followed him, abandoning his fortified positions. Finding a convenient place to cross, Timur threw his elite units into the icy water under the cover of night. A fierce battle for the bridgehead began right in the river and on the bank. The incredible ferocity and iron discipline of Timur's warriors broke the resistance of the horde. By morning, most of his army was on the northern bank. The Battle of the Terek became one of the most grandiose and ferocious in history. Tokhtamysh, having learned from the bitter experience of Kondurcha, arranged his army in a deeper, more layered formation, strengthening the center and placing his best light cavalry on the flanks. Timur, on the other hand, staked everything on a powerful battering ram strike in the center and his favorite tactic, a flanking reserve. His battle order was even more complex. Infantry stood in the first line, protected by large shields and field fortifications, with heavy cavalry arranged in several lines behind them. After the traditional exchange of archery, when thousands of arrows, according to eyewitnesses, darkened the sun, Tokhtamysh launched his cavalry into the attack. On the left flank, the horde met with success. They crushed the enemy's forward units and began to push them back, threatening to get into their rear. At this critical moment, just as at Kondurcha, Timur brought his strategic reserve into play. He personally led a counterattack of elite heavy cavalry, striking at the junction between the horde's center and flank. At the same time, according to chroniclers, some of Tokhtamysh's emirs, bribed by Timur, left the battlefield, exposing the flank. The center of Tokhtamysh's army, attacked from the front and the flank, wavered. And then Timur employed another of his innovations, a psychological attack. His warriors, as sources claim, began to shout that Khan Tokhtamysh had fled. This cry, repeated many times, spread across the entire battlefield. Panic erupted in the ranks of the horde, who were already disoriented. Everyone believed that their Khan had abandoned them. The formation broke. Warriors who had been fighting desperately a moment before now thought only of their own survival. The retreat turned into a disorderly flight, and then into a monstrous slaughter. The defeat was total and final. The army of the Golden Horde essentially ceased to exist. The battlefield was strewn with corpses for many kilometers. Tokhtamysh himself miraculously escaped again, fleeing with a small group of bodyguards north into the forests of Volga, Bulgaria. But this time, Timur was not satisfied with just a victory in battle. He decided to fulfill his oath and destroy the Ulis of Yochi itself. After the battle, his army, divided into several detachments, moved deep into the territory of the Golden Horde. An economic and demographic genocide began. Timur's goal was not conquest, but complete and final destruction, so that the Golden Horde could never again threaten his empire. His army, like a swarm of locusts, swept through the entire Volga region. All the largest cities were taken, plundered, and burned to the ground. New Sarai, Old Sarai, Haji Tarkhan, Bulgar. These cities, which had been centers of civilization, craft, and trade, were wiped from the face of the earth. Their populations were either massacred or driven into slavery. Archaeological excavations at the site of the Horde's capital, Sarai, show a thick layer of ash dating precisely to this period. The city never recovered from the blow. Timur systematically destroyed the economic foundation of the Horde's power. He destroyed the irrigation systems in the Volga region. He crushed the Genoese trading posts in the Crimea and on the Don. And most importantly, he rerouted the northern branch of the Great Silk Road from the steppes to his own capital, Samarkand, depriving the Horde of its main source of income. Timur's campaign of 1395 was a mortal blow to the Golden Horde. It was not just a military catastrophe, but a civilizational collapse. Cities were destroyed, a significant part of the population was exterminated, and trade was undermined. The Horde was thrown back centuries in its development, once again becoming a wild steppe. The unified state effectively ceased to exist. On its ruins, new warring khanates would soon emerge. Kazan, Astrakhan, Crimea, Siberia, as well as the Nogai Horde. The apocalypse on the Terek River became the true end of the great empire of Jochi. And the main culprit of this catastrophe was its last great Khan, Tokhtamysh. Blinded by pride and a thirst for revenge, he challenged a power he could not match and plunged his country and his people into a fire that consumed them completely. The defeat on the Terek turned Tokhtamysh into a perpetual exile, a Khan without a Khanate, a commander without an army. But even in this seemingly hopeless situation, he did not give up. The last decade of his life is the tragic and stubborn story of a man clinging to power until his last breath. After fleeing the battlefield at the Terek, he found temporary refuge in the lands of the Volga Bulgars. Timur, having ravaged the central domains, did not pursue him. He installed a puppet Khan in Sarai and went south, believing he was done with Tokhtamysh for good. He underestimated his enemy. As soon as Timur's troops left, Tokhtamysh began to gather supporters again, and many in the Horde who were unwilling to submit to the Iron Lame's protégés saw him as a legitimate symbol of resistance. However, a new, deadly enemy now appeared within the Horde itself. This enemy was Emir Edigu. He had once been a commander under Timur, and after Timur's departure, relying on loyal tribes, He became the de facto ruler in the region between the Volga and Yaik rivers. Like Mamai, he was not a Genghis, but it was now he who enthroned and deposed puppet khans. A long and merciless struggle began between the legitimate but powerless Tokhtamysh and the powerful but illegitimate Edigu. Tokhtamysh's forces dwindled. Realizing he could not succeed alone, he began to seek help from outside the horde, and his gaze turned west to the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. At that time, Lithuania was ruled by the ambitious and powerful Grand Duke Vytautas, whose state stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea. And Vytautas, exactly as Timur had once done, saw in the exiled Khan Tokhtamysh a valuable tool for his grand imperial policy. Vytautas's dream was to subjugate the weakened Golden Horde by placing his own vassal, a puppet Khan, on its throne. This would allow him to control the trade routes and secure the southern borders of his state. He received Tokhtamysh with honor and promised him full military assistance. In exchange for this promise, Tokhtamysh, a Khan without a Khanate, made a final gesture of desperation. He issued Vytautas a yarlik, a charter, for all the Russian lands, effectively transferring to him the rights of supreme suzerainty over Moscow and other principalities. The depth of this man's fall and the consequences of his decisions are topics that deserve their own analysis, so that we can continue to tell such stories. Subscribe to our channel, give us a like, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support helps us recreate the great dramas of the past